Loss of force. The concept of force is an essential idea in the work, for in order to awaken, an individual must have force. Without force they cannot awaken. The concept of force therefore can best be understood if it is studied from two angles. The work says that a person loses force in many specific ways, which it mentions, that they gain force by work on them, and that they create force through the act of self-remembering. Examining then the loss of force. We are told that we can only begin to awaken after much effort and long struggle, that this is due to the fact that life wants us to remain asleep for its own reasons. This means that life prevents us from conserving force, or put another way, life takes force from us. Since we are nothing but a mass of habits, life forms early on in us various habits of losing force, sometimes extremely complex ones. So we lose force mechanically, just as we do everything else mechanically. However, it is difficult to see how we lose force, for we have to view ourselves in the light of new knowledge, to exchange our old ideas for new, in order to realize what is continually happening. A person may lose force in a flash, just through touching some negative emotion. They are grounded, as a lightning bolt to earth. In the work, which is long, we begin to realize that we are faced by this mass of habits that are not us. This is a painful experience and unnecessary to enter into it unless one is convinced that there is something to attain. To awaken, anything anti-mechanical may help. Self-observation is anti-mechanical, so must come before everything else. However, it is within non-identifying that the main key lies to preventing the loss of force, as every act of non-identifying saves force. We are speaking here of the force necessary for awakening. If we identify with everything, both inner and outer, then we cannot have force for doing or understanding the work. The work will remain far away as some vague cloud. After a time we begin to notice that one is asleep. That is, we begin to notice that we have lost force. At the same time we notice that the work and its ideas seem very far away. When we begin to have a barometer of this kind, it is possible to study in more detail what it is that causes a loss of force. Although the causes of such loss can be arranged in general categories that apply to everyone, such as negative states, each person has their own particular causes that need to be observed personally in the greatest detail, then reflected upon with skillfulness in the light of new understanding that the work gives. Otherwise there is no sincerity with oneself upon which anything can be built. Nor could there be any center of gravity established by the influence of the work, so nothing will reach us that belongs to real I. All this belongs to the necessity of valuation that is spoken of, for without valuation of this work there can be no sincerity with it, nor can there be a definite inner perception of loss of force. This means that a person will not notice that they are asleep, although they may note that the work seems distant. It is interesting to begin to notice the sources of loss of force, and the conditions connected with them. There are certain trains of thought, for instance, that cause a loss of force, and it may take some time before we can see why. It often happens that things we thought quite harmless, or even admirable, might cause a loss of force. What Robert Pirsig refers to as the loss of gumption. To recap briefly that other angle, and what creates force. It is the act of self-remembering that creates force. The opening of our mind to the act, the meaning and significance of self-remembering. Then an accompanying separation from all one's usual ideas of oneself, from our usual small feelings and internal considering, which actually creates force. So we gain force through any act of non-identifying, because one prevents its loss, and the other creates force through self-remembering. We can therefore see that it is necessary to isolate ourselves from the action of life. However, to understand what this means in a general sense, and what it means for each of us in our particular situation, is not something handed down ready-made. It is only gradually that we begin to see for ourselves where our path lies. Many individuals show impatience with the work. It never ceases to amaze how people expect in a short time to reach states that demand a lifetime of effort. There is always something outside of us, and there is certainly something inside that a person should try to isolate themselves from. What does it mean then to isolate ourselves? We could even say, insulate, here, because if life takes all force and keeps us asleep, then it is necessary to isolate ourselves from at least some of its varying powers over us. Some people are continually upset about something or other, about something they think very wrong. Let's say they are politically upset, morally upset, religiously upset, hygienically upset, distressed about the economy, or simply always stressing about something or other. They lose force. In these ways, life robs them of all force for awakening. They think, however, that they are doing right, which is not a good thing to think mechanically. When we feel adamantly that we are right, then we can rest assured that we are asleep. Life, of course, robs us of force in many other ways. We are unimportant in the ray of creation, and living on some distant point of the Milky Way, which is billion-sunned, and there are billions of Milky Ways throughout multiverses. We are indeed minuscule. However, there remains a chance. To have that double feeling is a form of self-remembering. With regard to self-remembering, which is the means of actually creating force, remember the first conscious shock, and the energies resulting from it. There are many ways to self-remember, however they all depend upon the feeling that there is something else, that life on this third rock from the sun is not explicable in terms of itself. There remains something more. We then reflect upon the solar octave, until it becomes a living thing in our mind and speaks to us. Perhaps then we begin to see what isolation truly means. However often we might experience moments in which we feel the future must surely be better, remember that there are always two futures. One in time, and one in scale. One horizontal, the other vertical, but always there nonetheless, right above our present state. There are many forms of self-remembering. But we have to get out of our own way, stop obstructing our own light. Then, as we are different at different moments, self-remembering is different at different times. The sly man knows this, so does not always practice the same method. To do so is to make it mechanical, and what is mechanical is useless for this work. They move, as it were, forward and then forward and so on. In any case they experiment. Noticing what was and is no longer useful, then formulating some other way and so on. More could be said here of the fox or of sly man, however we should above all think of and study to become conscious of ourselves, then try to self-remember each day. Try to get out of our own way. Try to let something get in that cannot, simply because we are obstructing its path. Try to stop the noise of yourself even for a moment, try to get out of the ordinary feeling of yourself. Try to become no one for a moment, or in contrast try to feel the intense reality of the self. Sense the feeling of I in everything that you have to do. All these are different ways of remembering oneself. There are many other ways, however try to discover one for yourself, something very personal to begin with, and then get to know the taste of it. That's how we know more distinctly when we are asleep, because we are trying to awaken to another level of life. We believe this is the real meaning of our existence, however to awaken we must have force. Whatever we do consciously remains, whatever we do mechanically is lost to us. So we have to learn how to live in life, and not to be consumed by life. Identify with life, give all of your force to life and you cannot awaken, just as you cannot if you identify with yourself. How rich that young man felt himself in the parable, how identified he was with all of his virtues and talents, his excellences. He was told to go and sell all that he had before he could awaken, which made him very sorrowful. Think what it would mean to cease to ascribe to yourself everything that you do or think that you are, to be told to sell all your possessions. Who can imagine what this really means? Have you caught even the slightest glimpse yet of its meaning with regard to yourself? If so, then you will begin to realize where your force goes in every moment, how it is used, and why people are asleep without knowing it. The necessity of observing how we lose force and noticing what is the cause of it has been touched upon here. Internal considering is part of the great subject of identifying, and identifying is the greatest of all evils for mankind. Many people think that worrying about other people will help them. They even imagine that it is right to be in a worried, anxious state about everybody else, to undertake works of charity and benefaction. However, what we have to understand is this does not help anyone. If we are very worried and anxious about someone that is ill, it does not help either you or that other person. Being identified never helps. It is exactly in this way that we take force from other people, through identifying with them, and we keep them, as it were, in prison, ourselves too. You have probably noticed how easy it is for two people to put themselves into prison, then create their own useless suffering within. We can lose force by thinking of someone with whom we are identified. We do not treat each other well inside ourselves, and have to release one another. If we could somehow adopt the right attitude to another person, we then would be free from one another. From this is meant, we should not be in a kind of bondage, or codependency. To find the right attitude really means to find a point of equilibrium, where one is not in either of the opposites. Identifying with the other person is the reverse of this, for being identified is almost the only emotion that we experience. Even if, for a moment we experience a trace of real emotion, it almost immediately becomes mixed with some form of identifying and projecting. For example, we ascribe, say, a momentary feeling of love to ourselves, and instantly the whole situation within is changed. Of course, if we believe that there is nothing higher than ourselves, it becomes impossible not to identify always in one way or another. And this means the loss of force. We do not become more conscious of one another through identifying, but less conscious. To become more conscious requires more force. The objective of this work is to increase consciousness. If we were more conscious, then all war would cease. If we became more conscious of other people, our whole relationship towards them would change. External considering is a development of consciousness. Consciousness can grow only in certain directions. Self-knowledge is one direction, external considering is another direction. If you could put yourself in the place of all the people whom you were about to kill with a bomb, you would be unable to do anything, and never consider the act martyrdom. It would come as a terrific shock to realize what you were about to do, which would be an increase of consciousness. Force would increase in you, but you might go to sleep a moment later through identifying with feelings of revenge, personal insult, and so on. Then you would lose force, and immediately that area of your consciousness would diminish. Instead of seeing many things together, you would again see only one thing, then look once more through a narrow slit. We can notice the states in which we feel much more awakened toward people, much less identified, and in which we begin actually to take in new impressions of others. This means that we are more conscious, that we have more force of consciousness. Then again we become identified, as when someone says something that we do not expect and so on, then we tumble down as it were into our ordinary state which has such a stale smell about it. One cause of losing force is through not being in the right center for what we are doing. This is comparatively easy to study in ourselves provided we know something of the work of different centers. For instance, if you are daydreaming and trying to do some job automatically that you dislike very much, you will be losing force all the time. If on the contrary you are in the right center and really engaged in something to which you are giving your full attention, in which perhaps even all centers are assisting, then you will not lose force but tend to gain force or even conserve it, because you are acting more consciously. You know what it is to do your daily work mechanically, and the difference if you do it more consciously. In the one case you get no impressions, in the other case you receive impressions. We realize how important it is to seal ourselves against states where force can leak out, and how much the work deals with these, how practically it speaks on these points. Perhaps some of us have not realized it yet. Perhaps we have not made the connection between the teaching of this work and our own inner experience. In any case, we should see that unless someone becomes hermetically sealed, they will be like a person putting to sea in a boat that is constantly springing leaks, who will have to keep on putting back to shore. Our situation is very similar. We have to isolate ourselves from the effects that have been automatically produced in us, and this requires a great deal of patient self-study, self-sincerity, and understanding of what this work is about. Certain ideas of the work are very important in this regard, and our attention can be called to one or two of them. Understanding the deeper meaning of the saying that we are mechanical and the saying that everything happens in the only way that it can happen in life. We have to realize that one cannot do. Begin to realize the meaning of these sayings and their truth, because otherwise our entire mental outlook will be wrong, which of course results in a loss of force, wastefully. It would be like having the wrong attitude to a machine that you are trying to run in the best possible way. You do not understand the mechanisms, keep pulling the wrong levers, and do not see what it really is. It is something like that which is meant when said that we must understand the meaning of guidance. For example, if we take everyone as fully conscious, then we shall continually lose force. We are not conscious. We do not speak and do things consciously. There are not certain people running the affairs of life, some people call they, and everything is happening in the only way that it can possibly happen. In Gurdjieff's words, when Ouspensky asked him once what he ought to do. What to do, asked Gurdjieff, as though surprised. It is impossible to do anything. One must first of all understand certain things. They have thousands of false ideas and false concepts, chiefly about themselves, and they must get rid of some of them before beginning to acquire anything new. Otherwise the new will be built upon a wrong foundation, and the result will be worse than before. How can one get rid of false ideas? Ouspensky asked. We depend on the forms of our perception. False ideas are produced by the forms of our perception. Gurdjieff shook his head. Again you speak of something different, he said. You speak of errors arising from perceptions, but I am not speaking of these. Within the limits of given perceptions we can be more or less deluded. As I have said before, our chief delusion lies in the conviction that we can do. All people think that they can do, all people want to do, and the first question all people ask is what are they to do? But actually nobody does anything, and nobody can do anything. This is the first thing that must be understood, which is that everything happens. All that befalls us, all that is done by us, all that comes from us, all of this just happens. And it happens in exactly the same way as rain falls as a result of a change in the temperature of the atmosphere, as snow melts under the rays of the sun, as dust rises with the wind. We are mechanical. Our deeds, actions, words, thoughts, feelings, convictions, opinions and habits are the result of external influences, external impressions. Out of the self, we cannot produce a single thought, a single action. Everything that we say, do, think or feel, all of this just happens. We cannot discover anything, cannot invent anything, because it all simply happens. To establish this fact for oneself, to understand it, to be convinced of its truth, means getting rid of 1,000 illusions about ourselves, about being creative and consciously organizing our own affairs and so on. There is nothing of this kind because everything happens. Popular movements, wars, revolutions, changes of government, fads, fashions, trends and ideas, all of this happens. And it happens in exactly the same way as everything else happens in the life of individuals. We are born, we live, die, build houses, write books, drive automobiles, not as we want to, but as it happens. Everything happens. We do not hate, love, desire. All this happens. But no one will ever believe you if you tell them they can do nothing. This is the most offensive and the most unpleasant thing you could tell people. And it is particularly unpleasant and offensive because it is the truth. And nobody wants to know the truth.